Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that focuses on some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, as well as highlighting their history, culture, and geopolitics. Today, we're going to start on a new country, and I'll get to that in just a few moments. But first of all, I want to cover a few things. First of all, my shirt. I was told not to wear this shirt, uh, but I like it. So if you don't, I apologize. You can log off right now, do whatever you need to. I like the shirt. I wear the shirt. That's the way it is. So hopefully it won't be too distracting for this episode. Secondly, all of my Some Stops Along the Way podcast episodes tie back to my work around the world, which is included in my memoir, which is available on Amazon. Hope you will try to grab a copy of that. We are in a series now called Islam's Fault Line, and we're covering some fascinating countries that are not only Islamic, but are countries that have really defined Islam around the world. We started with the country of Egypt in North Africa. We moved on to Tunisia. We did Morocco. Now we're picking up a very interesting and complex country of Libya. Now, I want to say first and foremost that I've spent very little time in Libya during my career. Spent a lot of time on the border of Libya, but not a lot of time actually in Libya. But I don't think that one can really understand North Africa or the complexity around the role of Islam in the world without looking at Libya. And so I wanted to include that in this series. When we think about Libya, especially those of us in the United States, we typically think about a personality, Muammar Gaddafi. But the country is so much more than that. It would be wrong for us to lump everything we know about this fascinating country of Libya into this cult of personality around Muammar Gaddafi. Because Libya's story didn't begin in 1969 when Gaddafi came to power. Far from it. So I want to take a little bit of time, first and foremost, to talk about pre-Gaddafi Libya. You see, before Gaddafi's rise, Libya was at the crossroads of empires. It was a land shaped by desert tribes, by Mediterranean trade, by colonial ambitions, and of course, a struggle to build a modern state. Libya's culture is ancient. Its geographic positioning is strategic, and its politics are deeply influenced by forces that came long before the 20th century. So, as I said, first and foremost, we're going to explore Libya's history, culture, and geopolitics prior to the reign of Muammar Gaddafi. We're going to look at the Libya that set the stage for everything that came after. Libya's story begins long before the modern nation existed. The land we now call Libya, as a matter of fact, was a home to Berber tribes for thousands of years. The Amazigh people, who we talked about in the episode on Morocco, had languages and traditions that still echo across the desert. Along the coast, the ancient Greeks established colonies like Cyrene, a wealthy city-state known for philosophy, trade, and medicinal plant and medicinal plants. To the west, the Phoenicians and later the Carthaginians built trading posts that linked North Africa to the Mediterranean world. Then came Rome. Libya became part of the Roman Empire, divided into three different regions that still define Libya's internal identity today. Roman cities flourished, amphitheaters, temples, and markets rose from the desert. Even today, the ruins of Leptis Magna are among the best preserved Roman sites in the world. But beneath the surface, tribal identity remained strong. Geography reinforced it. Three regions separated by vast stretches of desert, each to its own history, loyalties, and rhythms of life. That fragmentation didn't mean that much in the beginning, but later on it became a significant issue in Libya's development. In the 7th century, Arab armies swept across North Africa, bringing Islam and the Arabic language. Over time, Libya became part of the Islamic world, ruled by the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, and eventually the Ottomans. Islam became a unifying cultural force. Sufi brotherhood spread across the desert, offering spiritual guidance and social cohesion. The most influential was the Sanusi order, founded in the 19th century by Muhammad al-Sanusi. It emphasized simplicity, piety, and tribal unity, and it would later play a major role in Libya's independence movement. But even under Islamic rule, Libya remained decentralized. Tripolitania looked toward Tunisia and the Western Mediterranean. Cyrenaica, another region, looked toward Egypt. Fezzan looked south toward the Sahara and the Sahel. Three regions, one land, no unified state. And this brings us to the early 20th century, when Italy, a young nation hungry for an empire, invaded Libya in 1911. The Italians expected a quick victory, but instead they faced fierce resistance, especially from the Sanusi tribes in Cyrenaica. The most famous leader of the resistance was Omar al-Mukhtar, the Lion of the Desert. For 20 years, he led a guerrilla warfare against the Italian forces. His capture and execution in 1931 became a defining moment in Libyan national memory. Italian rule, as was most of the colonial rule throughout Africa, was brutal. Concentration camps, forced relocations, thousands of Libyans died during this period. But Italy also built roads and ports and agricultural settlements, infrastructure that would later shape Libya's economy. By World War II, Libya was a battleground between the Axis and Allied forces. After the war, Italy lost its colonies. Libya fell under British and French administration. And for the first time, the idea of an independent Libyan state began to take shape. In 1951, Libya became the first country to gain independence through the United Nations. A new monarch was installed. His name was King Idris I. He was the leader of the Sanusi order. He was respected, pious, and cautious, but he faced enormous challenges. Libya was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had little industry. It had limited infrastructure. It had deep regional divisions. And so the monarchy relied heavily on tribal alliances. Then everything changed. What changed? Oil was discovered in 1959. Overnight, Libya went from an impoverished desert kingdom to one of the richest per capita nations on earth. Sounds great, huh? Well, they thought it was great. But oil wealth brought new tensions. For instance, how should the money be distributed? What region should benefit most? How should Libya modernize? And who should control the state? King Idris struggled to manage the rapid transformation. Remember, he was very pious. He was not prepared to deal with all of the issues surrounding this new wealth that the country had. Corruption grew. Younger Libyans, especially military officers, felt the monarchy was too conservative, too slow, and too dependent on the West. This set the stage for a revolution. Before Gaddafi, Libya's culture was a blend of ancient and modern, tribal and urban, Arab and Berber, Mediterranean and Saharan. Tribes were, and still are, the backbone of Libyan society. They shaped loyalty, conflict resolution, marriage, and political alliances. Libya was also deeply religious, but it was not extremist. The Sanusi tradition emphasized modernization, scholarship, and community. Arabic was and still is the dominant language, but Berber languages persisted in the Nafusa Mountains and the desert. Oral poetry, music, and storytelling were central to cultural life. Of course, Libya also has a Mediterranean influence, as most of the North African countries do. Tripoli and Benghazi were cosmopolitan port cities, shaped by centuries of trade with Europe. In the 1960s, Libya was still figuring out what it meant to be a modern state. Oil wealth accelerated modernization, but identity lagged behind. This tension between tradition and modernity would define coming decades. We've touched a little bit on Libya's location, but I want to make a point here that its location made the country strategically important long before Muammar Gaddafi. You see, Libya sits at the center of North Africa's coastline. It's a natural bridge between Europe, the Middle East, and the Sahel. By the late 1960s, Libya was a major oil exporter. Western companies, especially American and British, had enormous influence in the country. Also, the United States operated Wheelus Air Force Base near Tripoli, one of the largest American bases outside of the continental United States. The Soviets courted Arab nationalist movements. Libya was caught in the middle of these Cold War dynamics, and that complicated regional politics. Libya's neighbors, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Chad, all had their own revolutions, border disputes, and ideological movements. Libya was part of a region in flux from a geopolitical standpoint at the same time that its economy was growing and changing because of oil. Even with all this wealth, Libya lacked strong institutions. As a matter of fact, one could argue that it was this wealth that became an impediment to creation of strong institutions because too many people wanted the money. And strong institutions mean that there are rules to the game. And there were those who didn't want rules to the game because they benefited on there not being rules. The monarchy at this time was very fragile. The military was small but increasingly politicized. In short, Libya was rich, strategically located, and politically vulnerable. It was a perfect environment for a young revolutionary officer to seize power. By the late 1960s, King Idris was aging and increasingly absent from governance. Corruption scandals eroded the public trust. Students protested. Young officers whispered about change. The monarchy had no strong succession plan. Regional tensions were rising. Oil wealth was unevenly distributed. And the Arab world was still reeling from the 1967 Six-Day War, which fueled a new wave of Arab nationalism. It was with this backdrop that on September 1st, 1969, while King Idris was abroad for medical treatment, a group of young officers staged a bloodless coup. Their leader was 27-year-old Captain Muammar Gaddafi. But that story's for another episode, or at least another part of this episode. You see, Libya before Gaddafi was a land shaped by ancient civilizations, by tribal loyalties, by colonial trauma, and the sudden shock of wealth. It was a nation still searching for unity, identity, and direction. Understanding this history matters because it explains not only how Gaddafi came to power, but why Libya's modern challenges run so deep. In just a moment, we'll talk about Gaddafi extensively. But before we do, I want to go back to this point of the, the finding of oil in Libya that changed its entire economy. I've worked in some of the poorest countries in the world. I've also traveled in some of the richest countries in the world. And the quantum shock of an issue such as finding the amounts of oil that exist in Libya is a huge asset to a country, but also, as I said before, can be a huge liability. The immersion of wealth in Libya created a society where it was a literal free for all, and where the king had no ability to structure the society in a way that could make it successful. This is what caused, in part, the revolution. You see, revolutions typically come one of two ways. Either there is no economic opportunity and the country is so poor that the people eventually rebel, or there is economic opportunity, as in Libya with oil, but only a portion of society benefits from that and the rest of society does not. And when you mix that with a growing youth population that wants a better life than they have now, that is the nexus for revolution or for a change in government. And that's exactly what happened in Libya. And that led to the rise of Muammar Gaddafi. So I want to spend some time in this episode taking a deep dive into one of the most controversial, enigmatic, consequential leaders of the modern Middle East and North Africa. This man, Muammar Gaddafi, that all of us probably think we know something about because we saw him on the news for so much of our lives. But actually, he's a man that's shrouded in mystery. He's not a one-dimensional character. He's multidimensional. He's very complex. He ruled Libya for 42 years. He reshaped its society. He defied the West. He destabilized Africa. And he ultimately fell in one of the most dramatic collapses of Arab Spring. And by the way, we're going to do an entire episode later on Arab Spring because I think it's important to know when we talk about Islam's fault line what created Arab Spring and what happened as a result of Arab Spring. But that's a topic for another episode. Muammar Gaddafi's story is not just the rise and the fall of a dictator. It's the story of a nation caught between tribal identity and modern statehood, between pan-Arab dreams and African ambitions, between oil wealth and political repression. It's a story whose consequences Libya is still living with today. So, let's explore who Gaddafi was, how he came to power, how he ruled, why he fell, and what his legacy means for Libya and for the world. To understand Muammar Gaddafi, you have to start in the desert. He was born in 1942 near Sirte into a poor Bedouin family in a specific tribe called the Qadafis. He had no electricity, no formal schooling at first. A childhood shaped by tribal loyalty, Arab nationalism, and the humiliation many Arabs felt after the creation of Israel and the defeat of Arab armies in 1948 and 1956. As a young man, Gaddafi absorbed the writings of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president who championed pan-Arab unity and anti-imperialism. Nasser was his hero, his model, his North Star. Gaddafi joined the military, as many ambitious young men in the Arab world did, and like Nasser, he formed a clandestine group of officers called the Free Unionist Officers Movement, who believed Libya's monarchy was corrupt, Western controlled, and incapable of leading the nation into modernity. So on September 1st, 1969, at just 27 years old, Gaddafi and his fellow officers staged a bloodless coup, as I said before. King Idris was deposed, the Libyan Arab Republic was formed, and Gaddafi became its leader. He was young, he was charismatic, he was idealistic, he was determined to reshape Libya in his own image. Now, Gaddafi's reverence toward Nasser is really important here. If you remember the episodes about Egypt, Nasser was very much focused on nationalization, on pan-Arabism, on the Arabs taking control of their own destinies. And this shaped Gaddafi's mindset. In the early years of his rule, Gaddafi was wildly popular. He nationalized foreign oil companies. He increased Libya's revenues dramatically. He expelled foreign military bases. He poured money into education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Illiteracy plummeted. Life expectancy rose. Many Libyans genuinely believed he was building a new, proud, independent nation. But there was an issue, because Gaddafi wasn't content with just being a national leader. He wanted to be a regional visionary. He wanted to be an heir to Nasser. He pushed for unity with Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, and Syria. None of these succeeded. Arab leaders admired his passion but distrusted his unpredictability. At home, he introduced his political philosophy, the famous Green Book. It was a blend of socialism, Islam, and his own theories about direct democracy. He abolished traditional government institutions and replaced them with the People's Committees and the Revolutionary Councils. In theory, it was rule by the masses. In practice, it concentrated power in his hands. I mentioned this Green Book. It's been much discussed. Everybody in Libya had a copy of the Green Book. This was the directions for society. Years later, after Gaddafi was deposed, I managed to get a copy of the Green Book, which I keep locked away. Not because I ever agreed with virtually any of it, but because it's kind of an iconic memento of my time in that region. So even with his popularity, you started to see the wheels wobble with Gaddafi early on. But still in the 1970s, many Libyans saw him as a liberator, a modernizer, a man who stood up to the West. But the seeds of authoritarianism were already taking root. By the late 1970s, Gaddafi's rule hardened. Dissent was crushed. Political parties were banned. Students who protested were executed publicly. Exiles were hunted abroad, what Gaddafi called the stray dogs. The revolutionary committees became instruments of fear. Surveillance expanded. Tribal loyalties were manipulated to maintain control. Gaddafi's ideology grew more idiosyncratic. He declared himself the brother leader, the guide of the revolution, a man above formal titles, but who wielded absolute power. Libya's oil wealth funded his ambitions, and it also funded his repression. In the 1980s, Gaddafi's foreign policy took a dark turn. Libya supported militant groups across the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. The U.S. accused Libya of involvement in the 1986 Berlin discotheque bombing that killed American servicemen. In response, President Reagan ordered airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi. Gaddafi survived. His adopted daughter was killed. His anti-Western stance hardened even more. Then came the event that would define Libya's global isolation, the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. 270 people died. Western governments blamed Libyan intelligence operatives. Sanctions followed. Libya's economy suffered. Gaddafi's international reputation collapsed. Inside Libya, the regime tightened its grip. Outside Libya, Gaddafi became a pariah. By the late 1990s, Gaddafi recognized that isolation was unsustainable. He pivoted. He dramatically pivoted. He accepted responsibility for Lockerbie, though not personal guilt. He paid compensation to the victims' families and renounced weapons of mass destruction. Western sanctions were lifted, diplomats returned, oil companies re-entered Libya. At the same time, Gaddafi shifted his ideological focus from pan-Arabism to pan-Africanism, an important designation. He poured billions into African infrastructure, telecommunications, and political projects. He styled himself as a continental elder statesman, even suggesting the creation of the United States of Africa. Some African leaders admired him. Others saw him as erratic, but his influence was undeniable. Inside Libya, however, the political system remained constant, and that was a constant state of stagnation. Corruption grew, youth employment soared, oil wealth was unevenly distributed, and beneath the surface, resentment simmered. In early 2011, Arab Spring swept across the region. Tunisia fell, Egypt fell, and the Libyans, especially in the east, saw an opportunity. Protests erupted in Benghazi. Gaddafi responded with force. His infamous line, "I will cleanse Libya house by house," signaled that he intended to crush the uprising. The conflict escalated into civil war. Rebel groups formed, many along tribal lines. Gaddafi's forces advanced toward Benghazi. Western governments feared a massacre. NATO intervened with airstrikes, citing humanitarian grounds. Gaddafi's military infrastructure was degraded. Rebel forces gained momentum. By October 2011, Gaddafi was captured and killed near his hometown of Sirte. After 42 years, the Gaddafi era was over. But Libya's challenges were only beginning. You see, when Gaddafi fell, there was a wild celebration, as there had been when Ben Ali fell in Tunisia and when a new government was ensconced in Egypt with the fall of Mubarak. But in none of those cases, and certainly in Libya as well, the fall of Gaddafi didn't bring stability. In fact, it unleashed into forces that he had kept suppressed: the tribes, the militias, the regional rivalries, the ideological factions. You know, in my mind, when I think about this, I hearken back to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, when Marshal Josip Broz Tito, through his force of will, was able to keep the ethnic and religious forces in Yugoslavia together, or at least not causing significant trouble as long as he was in power. But once he went away, that laid the foundation for all of these fissures to crack even more and eventually to break apart. The same thing happened in Libya. Libya fractured after Gaddafi into competing centers of power. The General National Congress in Tripoli, the House of Representatives in Tobruk, dozens of militias controlling territory, Islamist groups, tribal coalitions, foreign powers backing rival factions. Oil fields became battlegrounds. Cities like Misrata, Zintan, and Benghazi became power centers. The Islamic State briefly gained a foothold in Sirte. Without strong institutions such as the courts, police, and a unified military, Libya struggled to build a functioning state. Many Libyans, even those who opposed Gaddafi, began to reflect on the paradox of his rule. He was a megalomaniac. He was an oppressor. But he also created stability. And so all of these groups began to really reflect on whether the cost of that stability was worth the chaos that followed. So, what was Gaddafi's legacy? Well, that depends on who you ask. This is true with virtually any leader in the world, but especially true with a polarizing figure like Muammar Gaddafi. Certainly, Gaddafi had a legacy of modernization. He used oil wealth to build schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. He raised literacy rates. He expanded access to housing and electricity. He had also, though, a legacy of repression. He dismantled institutions. He crushed dissent. He ruled through fear. He left Libya without the political structures needed for a peaceful transition. He had a legacy of tribal manipulation. He balanced tribes against each other, ensuring loyalty through patronage. When he fell, those tribal tensions resurfaced. He had a legacy of Pan-African influence. He invested heavily in Africa, especially its development and diplomacy. Some African leaders still speak of him with admiration. Of course, he had a strong legacy of international controversy. Lockerbie, the sanctions, terrorism accusations. His relationship with the West was volatile and deeply consequential. He had a legacy also of a vacuum. And this is perhaps his most enduring legacy. When he was assassinated, and he and his family pushed out as the leaders of Libya, the nation struggled to rebuild. And even today, it's still searching for unity, identity, and stability. Because today, Libya still remains divided. That's the bad news. The good news is it's not without hope. There are efforts toward national reconciliation. Oil production, though inconsistent, continues. Younger Libyans are increasingly connected to the world, eager for stability and opportunity. But there are huge challenges, such as building a unified military, creating functioning political institutions, managing tribal and regional rivalries, reducing foreign interference, and rebuilding trust after decades of authoritarian rule. Libya's future will depend on whether it can move beyond the shadow of Gaddafi, not by erasing his legacy, but by understanding it. Gaddafi's story is a reminder of how power can shape a nation, and virtually every episode of Some Stops Along the Way that we have recorded so far comes back to this story of how power shapes nations, but also how power can collapse and be reshaped again. In Gaddafi's case, he was a revolutionary, a dictator, a visionary to some, a tyrant to others. He modernized Libya and destabilized it. He challenged the West and courted it. He dreamed of unity and ruled through division. He was a man of conflict, but he was also a man of great, great vision. Maybe his vision was misguided, but no one could say that Muammar Gaddafi didn't have vision. The difference between he and Nasser in the end was that Gaddafi's reign was so long because he was able to pivot. He was able to, in some ways, repair his international image enough to, at a very critical time in Libya's history, pivot away from his past autocracy. In the end, though, with Arab Spring, it didn't matter. He fell along with the other leaders, most of the other leaders of North Africa outside of Algeria and Morocco. I hope you've enjoyed this episode on Libya. It is a country that I wish that I'd had the chance to work in more. It's a country that I wish I'd had the chance to help reshape the life after Gaddafi. But by that time, I was involved in other areas of the world and was never able to get back there. Although I have some good friends who were able to be part of the programs that were driving resurgence in the country. The challenge for Libya will be, as I said before, how to learn from its past. Politicians often don't learn lessons from the past very well. And that's true even here in America. You see, taking the same approach that you've always taken, you'll get the same results that you always got. And to think differently, they say, is insanity. So if Libya's current government takes the same type of journey that the last ones did and continues the corruption, the repression, the lack of systems, then it's likely to end up in a same or worse position than it did. Because, like it or not, as I said before, Gaddafi was a stabilizing force. Strong men are usually stabilizing forces because they have tight control. With those leaders like Gaddafi in Libya, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt gone, society began to digress into chaos. And Libya is still trying to dig itself out of chaos even today. In our next episode, we're going to move into other parts of Africa because I've worked extensively on the continent. And we're going to look at both the Islamic influences, and we're going to spend a few episodes pivoting back to the Middle East to look at countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. So we're not done with this discussion of Islam's fault line. This is less a discussion, at least right now, of Africa than it is Islam's influence in North Africa, and also the impact that that influence had on the continent itself. So we're going to be bouncing around from the Middle East to North Africa and other areas of the world under this thematic heading of Islam's fault line. And I hope you'll join me for each and every episode. Thanks for your time today for this short but hopefully interesting overview of Libya. And join me next Monday at 8 a.m. We'll be pivoting to a new country under this theme of Islam's fault line. I hope you'll be there. Until then, have a great week.